Nivelle didn't look at him when he walked in. She kept her eyes on the image in her hands, fingers trembling slightly as she held it against her stomach like it was the only thing keeping her steady. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Noh Ilyun noticed that first. Not the tears on her face. Not the way her breathing wasn't steady. But the silence. In his world, silence was never accidental. He closed the door behind him slowly. "Nivelle," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Look at me." She didn't. For a moment, something unfamiliar moved in his chest. Not concern. Not yet. Just irritation that didn't feel like irritation. Then she lifted the image. Just slightly. Enough for him to see it. At first, he didn't react. It was just a scan. A medical image. Something soft, blurred, meaningless. He stepped closer. His eyes sharpened. And then, he stopped. Two shapes. Not one. Two. His breath caught. Quiet but real. For the first time in years, Noh Ilyun didn't move because he chose not to. He moved because he couldn't. "What is this?" he asked. But his voice had already changed. Nivelle finally looked at him. There were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't begging. That was what unsettled him the most. She wasn't afraid of him in that moment. She was tired of him. "They're yours," she said softly. A pause. Then, "They're twins." The word didn't land all at once. It sank. Slowly. Like something heavy breaking through layers he had spent years building. Twins. His mind rejected it first. Then tried to control it. Then failed. Because this was not part of the plan. Noh Ilyun had married Nivelle for one reason. Revenge. Cold. Calculated. Precise. She was never meant to matter. Never meant to stay. And definitely never meant to carry anything that belonged to him. But now she was sitting in front of him, holding two lives that tied her to him in a way no contract ever could. And for the first time since the day he put a ring on her finger, Noh Ilyun didn't know what to do. 3 months earlier, he had looked at Nivelle and seen nothing more than a weapon. A quiet, convenient way to hurt the man who had once tried to destroy him. He had not seen her as a woman. He had not seen her as a wife. And he had never, not even for a second, imagined she would become the mother of his children. But revenge has a way of changing shape. And sometimes, the punishment you plan for someone else becomes the life you are forced to protect. Nivelle's hand tightened over her stomach as the silence stretched between them. The city lights behind her blurred through the glass, but she didn't turn to look. She didn't move at all. The only thing grounding her was the faint, steady pressure beneath her palm. A reminder that she wasn't alone, no matter how alone she felt. Noh Ilyun stood a few steps away, the ultrasound still burning in his vision. 2. His mind kept returning to it, refusing to settle. 2 lives. His. It didn't fit into anything he understood. He had seen men beg for their lives. He had watched empires fall without blinking. He had signed orders that ended things without hesitation. But this wasn't something he could command, or silence, or erase. "You should have told me," he said finally. His voice had regained its shape, but not its certainty. Nivelle let out a quiet breath that trembled at the edges. "Told you," she repeated softly, her lips barely moving. "So you could decide what to do with them too?" The words didn't rise. They didn't accuse. They settled. And somehow, that made them heavier. Ilyun's jaw tightened. For a moment, the familiar cold returned to his expression, the version of him that never questioned, never hesitated. But it didn't hold. Because his eyes betrayed him. They drifted again, back to her stomach, back to the place where everything had changed without his permission. Without his control. Nivelle saw it. The shift. The crack. And something in her own expression broke just slightly, not into weakness, but into something more dangerous. Truth. "You don't get to control this," she said quietly. "Not this." The words hung between them, fragile and absolute. For the first time since she had stepped into his world, Nivelle was no longer just surviving it. She was standing in it. And forcing him to see her. Ilyun didn't respond. He couldn't. Because every instinct he had built his life on, power, control, distance, was colliding with something that refused to bend. The silence returned. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of something neither of them knew how to name. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had changed. Inside that room, everything had. 3 months earlier, Noh Ilyun had made a decision without hesitation. He would marry Nivelle. Not for love. Not for loyalty. But for revenge. Noh Ilyun did not believe in wasted moves. Every decision he made had weight, direction, consequence. Nothing impulsive. Nothing loud. The kind of power he held didn't need noise to prove itself. So when the name Nivelle was placed in front of him, it wasn't emotion that guided him. It was calculation. Her guardian, once a trusted partner, had tried to dismantle everything Ilyun had built. Not through open war. Through quiet betrayal. Money diverted. Information leaked. Deals sabotaged from the inside. Murder would have been simple. Too simple. A clean death would have closed the matter in a single night. No message. No memory. No lasting consequence. Exile would have been worse. But still temporary. People returned from exile. Power shifted. Time softened losses. Ilyun didn't want something temporary. He wanted something that endured. Something that reminded the man, every single day, of what he had lost. So he chose something far colder. Marriage. Not to the man's daughter. To the one person he had protected the most carefully. Nivelle. She wasn't loud. She wasn't political. She wasn't even involved in the world that had collapsed around her. Which made her perfect. Because this wasn't about destroying an enemy. It was about reshaping his life. By placing Nivelle under his name, under his roof, under his control, Ilyun wasn't just punishing betrayal. He was rewriting the ending. Every time her guardian heard her name, it would no longer belong to him. It would belong to Ilyun. Permanent. Unchangeable. A living reminder. The wedding itself had been quiet. No celebration. No worms. Just signatures, witnesses, and a silence that felt heavier than any ceremony. Nivelle had stood beside him in white, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask questions. She didn't resist. And somehow, that unsettled him more than anything else. Because most people, when placed in front of power like his, either fought or broke. Nivelle did neither. She simply accepted. As if she understood something he hadn't said out loud. As if she already knew. This marriage was never meant to be lived in. Only endured. The house did not welcome her. It accepted her. There was a difference Nivelle felt the moment she stepped through the gates. Tall iron, silent guards, a driveway that curved too long before revealing the mansion itself, as if the place preferred distance before recognition. Inside, everything was precise. Polished floors that reflected light without warmth. Walls that carried no personal history, only curated art chosen for value, not memory. The air smelled faintly of something clean and expensive, but not lived in. Nothing in the house belonged to comfort. It belonged to control. The staff moved like they had rehearsed it. Quiet, efficient, eyes lowered just enough to show respect, never curiosity. They spoke to her when necessary, but never lingered. Never asked. Never assumed. And never, under any circumstance, mentioned him unless spoken to first. That was the first rule she learned. Not written. Not explained. But understood. Nivelle adjusted quickly. Not because she was unafraid, but because she paid attention. She noticed how the house shifted when Ilyun was present. Conversations ended before he entered a room. Footsteps softened. Doors opened before he reached them, then closed without sound behind him. Even the silence changed. It tightened. As if the walls themselves were aware of him. He rarely spoke to her. When he did, it was direct. Controlled. Never raised, never rushed. Instructions, not conversations. You will stay in the East Wing. Dinner is at 8. Do not leave the grounds without clearance. Nothing cruel in tone. Nothing gentle either. At night, the house became something else. Quieter. Heavier. Nivelle would stand by the window in her room, looking out at the empty grounds, the distant lights of the city far beyond the gates. It felt like a different world. One she no longer belonged to. She learned his routines without asking. When he returned. When he worked. When the house stilled completely because he had decided the day was over. And slowly, carefully, she learned something more important than any rule. Not what he said, but what he didn't. Because in a house like this, survival wasn't about obedience. It was about understanding the space between his silence. The marriage did not begin. It was established. There was no shift, no moment where two lives tried to meet in the middle. From the first night, it was clear. Nivelle had not been brought into his life to be known. She had been placed there. Noh Ilyun did not touch her unless necessary. Not out of restraint. But because he had no interest in crossing a line he did not consider real. She had a room. A schedule. A presence in the house that could not be ignored, but was never acknowledged beyond function. Meals were shared, but not together. She sat at one end of the table, he at the other, the distance between them long enough to feel intentional. Conversations did not exist. Only the quiet movement of utensils, the faint sound of glass, the weight of being seen without being addressed. If she spoke, he answered. If she didn't, he never filled the silence. Control came in smaller ways. More deliberate ways. Her access to the outside world was filtered. Calls monitored. Visits denied without explanation. The gates remained closed unless he allowed otherwise. Not imprisonment. Not exactly. But nothing she did existed without passing through him first. And the worst part, he never raised his voice. Never insulted her. Never needed to. Because everything he did said the same thing, over and over, without words. You are here because I allowed it. There were moments, brief, sharp ones, where something almost human surfaced. A glance that lingered a second too long. A pause before he spoke, as if considering something he chose not to say. But they disappeared as quickly as they came. Controlled. Buried. As if he had trained himself not to feel them at all. Nivelle learned to move within that space. Carefully. Not shrinking, but never pushing. She kept her dignity in the only way she could, by not breaking where he expected her to. By meeting his silence with her own. By refusing to become small, even when everything around her was designed to make her feel it. And slowly, without saying it out loud, the truth settled between them. This was not a marriage built on hatred. That would have been easier. This was something colder. Something far more dangerous. Indifference, perfected. At first, Nivelle thought it was exhaustion. The kind that settles quietly into the body and refuses to leave. She woke later than usual one morning, her limbs heavier than they should have been, her thoughts slow to follow. The house moved as it always did, precise, controlled, but she felt slightly out of step with it, like something inside her had shifted without asking permission. She ignored it. There was no space here for weakness. The second time, it was the nausea. Sharp. Sudden. It came while she was standing at the long dining table, untouched breakfast laid out before her. The scent of food, once neutral, barely noticeable, turned overwhelming. She stood too quickly, her chair scraping softly against the floor, and excused herself before anyone could look too closely. In the privacy of her room, she pressed her hand against the cool marble of the sink and waited for it to pass. It did. But it left something behind. A question. Days went by. The fatigue deepened. The nausea returned, not always, but enough to be remembered. And beneath it all, something quieter began to take shape. A knowing she didn't want. A possibility she refused to name. She counted the days. Then counted again. Each time, the numbers aligned in a way that made her chest tighten. No, she whispered once, barely audible even to herself. Not here. Not like this. She waited longer than she should have, hoping it would pass, hoping her body would correct itself, return to something familiar, something safe. It didn't. The confirmation came in silence. A small room, white walls, a screen she almost didn't look at, until she did, and everything inside her stilled. Not emptiness, not uncertainty, life, clear, undeniable. And then, too, her fingers tightened instinctively over her stomach, as if she could protect something she had only just learned existed. The room felt smaller suddenly, colder, because the truth wasn't just what she carried. It was who it belonged to. Nivelle left without speaking more than necessary. She didn't cry. Not yet. But the weight of it followed her back through the gates, through the silent halls, into the room that had never felt like hers. She stood there for a long time, one hand resting lightly against her stomach. Alone. Not in the way she had been before. Something had changed. Everything had. And still, she said nothing. Because the man who ruled this house with absolute control was not a man she trusted with something so fragile. Not yet. The word stayed in the room long after it was spoken. Twins. Noh Ilyun didn't move. He was still looking at the scan, but not seeing it the same way anymore. The shapes had changed. What had been abstract a moment ago was now real, defined, unavoidable. His hand came up slowly, as if to take the image, then stopped midway. He lowered it again. I asked you a question, he said, but the control in his voice was thinner now. Why didn't you tell me? Nivelle let out a quiet breath, her fingers tightening slightly against her stomach. Because I didn't know what you would do, she said. There was no hesitation. No softness to hide behind. Just truth. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it lands. Ilyun's jaw clenched. The familiar cold began to return, instinctively, the version of him that knew how to respond to everything with distance and precision. What I would do, he repeated. But even as he said it, something in him resisted the words. Because he already knew the answer. He had spent 3 months showing her exactly what he was capable of. Silence. Control. Indifference. A marriage built without care, without protection, without any reason for her to believe she, or anything connected to her, would ever be safe. Nivelle stepped forward slightly. Not close enough to reach him. But close enough that he couldn't pretend she was distant anymore. You married me to hurt someone else, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. You made me part of something I didn't choose. Her eyes met his. And now there are 2 lives inside me that didn't choose it either. The words didn't rise. They pressed. Slow and unrelenting. Ilyun inhaled, but it didn't feel like enough. The air in the room had shifted, heavier than before, harder to move through. He looked at her. Really looked. Not as a decision. Not as a consequence. But as a person standing in front of him, carrying something that belonged to him in a way he had never planned for. His gaze dropped again, to her stomach, then back to her face. And for the first time, there was no calculation in his expression, only something unfamiliar, unsteady. You think I would hurt them, he said quietly. Nivelle didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The silence between them carried everything he had already shown her. And everything he hadn't yet become. Ilyun's chest tightened. Because for the first time since this began, he wasn't standing above the consequences of his actions. He was standing inside them. Something in the house shifted after that night. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone could point to. But it was there. In the pauses. In the way doors stayed open a second longer. In the way staff looked once, then quickly looked away. They felt it before they understood it. Noh Ilyun had changed. It started with small things. Orders delayed. Decisions reconsidered. Meetings that ended earlier than expected. Nothing drastic. Nothing careless. But enough. Enough for the men who had worked beside him for years to notice the difference. Because Ilyun was not a man who hesitated. And now, he did. Something is distracting you. The voice came from across the table, calm but edged. Han Seokjin had been with him longer than most. Loyal. Observant. Not reckless enough to accuse, but not blind enough to ignore. Ilyun didn't look up from the document in front of him. Be careful what you imply, he said evenly. Seokjin didn't back down. We've postponed 2 operations this week, he replied. You've never done that. Silence. Heavy. Measured. Ilyun signed the page in front of him with deliberate precision, then set the pen down. Adjustments are not weakness, he said. No, Seokjin agreed quietly. But hesitation can be. The words lingered longer than they should have. Because they weren't entirely wrong. Outside those walls, the shift traveled faster. Information always did. Rivals who had once moved carefully around Ilyun began testing edges. Small disruptions. Minor challenges. Nothing direct. Yet. But enough to ask a question. Had the man who never faltered begun to? Inside the house, the pressure settled differently. Nivelle felt it before she saw it. The staff had grown more attentive. More careful. Eyes lingered on her now, not out of curiosity, but calculation. Doors that once opened without thought were now watched. Her movements, noted. Not restricted. But no longer ignored. And Ilyun. He hadn't returned to the version of himself she had known before. But he hadn't moved forward either. He existed somewhere in between. Watching more than speaking. Present, but not distant. Controlled, but no longer untouched. The house held its breath around them. Because something had entered his world that didn't follow his rules. And everyone could feel it. Even if no one dared say it out loud. Power was still his. But for the first time, it wasn't absolute. And in a world like his, that was enough to start a war. It happened quietly. The way most dangerous things did in Ilyun's world. No warning. No spectacle. Just a small shift that, if unnoticed, would have ended everything. Nivelle felt it before she understood it. A faint bitterness at the back of her throat as she lifted the glass. Not strong enough to alarm. Not immediate enough to stop her. But wrong. She paused. Just for a second. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass as something instinctive pulled her back. Then, a hand closed over hers. Firm. Precise. Stopping her. Don't. Ilyun's voice was low, controlled, but sharper than she had ever heard it. He took the glass from her without asking, his eyes already scanning the room. The staff froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence this time was not disciplined. It was afraid. He didn't taste it. He didn't need to. He turned the glass slightly, watching the liquid settle, his expression unreadable, but something beneath it had changed. This wasn't calculation. This was recognition. Who prepared this? He asked. No one answered. Because in a house like this, the truth was never simple. And everyone knew it. Nivelle's breath had gone shallow. Not from panic. From understanding. She slowly lowered her hand to her stomach, instinctively, protectively. The movement did not go unnoticed. Ilyun saw it. And something in him snapped, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because this was no longer about power, or revenge, or control. This was about 2 lives that had done nothing but exist. And someone had already decided they shouldn't. Lock the house down, he said. The command didn't rise. It cut. Immediate. Absolute. Security moved. Doors sealed. Footsteps echoed sharper now, faster, less controlled. For the first time since she had entered this place, the house felt unstable. Ilyun stepped closer to her. Not enough to touch. But enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like protection. Did you drink anything else? He asked. Nivelle shook her head. He exhaled once, slow, measured. But his eyes had changed. The restraint was still there. The control. But underneath it, something far more dangerous had taken its place. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. More final. Because the truth had settled fully now. This was not an accident. Not a mistake. Not a test. Someone had reached into his house and tried to end what he hadn't even learned how to protect yet. And for the first time, Noh Ilyun understood something with absolute clarity. The twins were no longer a consequence of his actions. They were a target. The house did not sleep that night. It watched. Every corridor carried movement. Every door opened with purpose. The quiet order Ilyun had built over years tightened into something sharper, more dangerous. He stood alone in his office, the city spread out beneath him, untouched by what was about to change. On the desk in front of him lay the plan. 3 months of precision. Names. Routes. Accounts. Every piece arranged to dismantle the man who had betrayed him. It had been perfect. Clean. Final. All he had to do was continue. Behind him, the door opened softly. He didn't turn. Nivelle is secured, Sykkjin said. No one gets near her. A pause. Give the order, he added quietly. We finish this tonight. That was what they had always done. No hesitation. No reconsideration. Power moved forward. Always. Ilyun's hand rested on the file. He could feel the weight of it. Not the paper. The choice. Because finishing this plan meant more than revenge now. It meant escalation. Exposure. War that would not stay contained. War that would reach everything connected to him. Everything connected to her. His gaze dropped. For a moment, the image returned. 2 shapes. 2 heartbeats. Cancel it. The words came out steady. But they did not belong to the man who had built this plan. Sykkjin went still. What? Pull everything back, Ilyun said. All operations. All movements. Silence. Heavy. You're choosing them, Sykkjin said, the realization settling slowly. Over this. Ilyun turned then. And for the first time, there was no distance in his expression. No calculation. Only certainty. I'm choosing what comes after this, he said. The shift was immediate. Orders reversed. Accounts frozen. Contacts cut. But it wasn't enough. Because someone inside had already moved. Someone who knew. Someone who had seen weakness and acted on it. Find them, Ilyun said quietly. Not loud. Not angry. Worse. Final. They don't leave this house. What followed was not chaos. It was correction. Precise. Controlled. Ruthless. The traitor surfaced faster than expected. They always did when the system closed around them. A name. A face. A man who had stood too close for too long. Ilyun didn't raise his voice when he gave the last order. He didn't need to. Because this wasn't revenge anymore. This wasn't pride. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was protection. And for the first time in his life, Noh Ilyun went to war not to destroy something, but to make sure it survived. The house was quiet again. Not the same silence as before. That silence had been controlled. Ordered. Built to keep everything exactly where it belonged. This one was different. It carried what had happened. What had almost been lost. Nivelle stood by the window, her hand resting gently over her stomach, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. She was still here. That alone felt unfamiliar. Not relief. Not yet. Just the absence of danger pressing in on every side. Behind her, the door opened. She didn't turn immediately. She knew it was him. The house no longer shifted the way it used to when Noh Ilyun entered a room. It didn't tighten. It didn't brace. And somehow, that change felt louder than anything else. I ended it, he said. His voice was the same. Controlled. Measured. but it no longer carried distance. Nivelle turned slowly. Everything? She asked. A pause. Yes. Not just the plan. Not just the enemy. Something deeper. Something that had defined him long before she ever stepped into his world. She studied him quietly. Not as the man who had married her. Not as the one who had controlled every space she stood in. But as someone standing in front of her, without the armor he had built around himself. He looked the same. But he wasn't. You don't trust me, he said. It wasn't a question. Nivelle didn't answer immediately. Because trust wasn't something spoken into existence. It was something rebuilt. Piece by piece. After it had been broken in ways that couldn't be undone. I don't know you, she said softly. The truth didn't hurt. It settled. And for the first time, he didn't resist it. His gaze dropped briefly to where her hand rested. A small movement. But intentional. Acknowledged. Protected. Not claimed. I'm learning, he said. The words were simple. But they carried something he had never offered before. Not power. Not control. Something quieter. Something far more difficult. Choice. Time would not erase what had happened. It wouldn't soften the reasons they stood where they did. But it had already done something else. It had forced a man who built his life on revenge to stand in front of something he could not dominate. Something that did not respond to fear. Something that required him to become different. Or lose it entirely. The future had arrived before he was ready. And it had not asked permission. Because power can force obedience. But it cannot build what must be chosen. Revenge can feel like justice. Until innocence stands in its path. And sometimes, the life a man never planned to create becomes the only thing capable of saving him.